I don't even know, why is he going to Brussels? It just seems like he's just kind of like trying to signal, oh, look, they won't talk to me.
Should have said that on
I'm technically still recording, I could put it in. Hello and welcome to Lit on Lockdown, where we'll be discussing the fortnight's news. I'm Frances Weetman, editor of Lit, and I'm joined by Adam Barnett, columnist at Lit. And our first item of discussion today is Brexit. So Adam, how do you think Brexit is going?
It's made me see the light. I repent all my previously stated positions and now realise I was wrong the whole time. If I'd have known, if they'd have told me before the referendum that we could be having naval skirmishes with the French over access to mackerel and cod, I would have been a hard Brexiter. I would be very, very excited about the prospects for the country, and all of my worries would have been assuaged.
But no, there's one day to go. It really looks like we're going to end up with no deal. And just seeing the headline this morning in the Daily Mail saying that they're going to deploy ships in case the French are going to fish in our waters. Yes. It just seems like an extra dollop of insane at the end of an insane year.
Well, the Daily Mail is just trying to, I think, match my enthusiasm for where everything's going.
Sunlit uplands, war with Europe.
I mean, it's what everyone wants, clearly. It's what we've been dreaming of, to reclaim the glories of the 18th century when we ruled the waves. You know, finally, Britain will be great again. This is what people have been voting for years. So I just hope they're going to be pleased with what they get. I did notice, though, that Boris Johnson, when asked, said that he thought leaving the European Union without a deal would be wonderful. But then he added, it's obviously different. It obviously will be different from what we set out to achieve. And I thought, well, quite. But it did also call to mind some expressions that you don't hear anymore that were quite prevalent during this whole 4-year farce. Hard Brexit is a term that sort of vanished along with soft Brexit. Closest possible relationship with Europe was another one. That was what we were trying to achieve. Frictionless borders came up quite a lot. You don't even hear will of the people too much now. That's all sort of faded. And certainly no one really seems to have the confidence or spirit or the nerve, perhaps, to continue to spout the propaganda we've had for so long about the benefits. It's just something we're doing because we have to do it.
I was just thinking, perhaps we have reached a turning point in which I am noticing on social media that some fairly prominent supporters of Leave are now saying this isn't what they themselves voted for, which seems like a fairly large admission after the last several years of what seems like spin, where the implication was that there was a democratic mandate to effectively go to war with Europe, which obviously isn't the case. You can look at like Nigel Farage was spending half of the Leave campaign prior to the referendum promising that it was going to be very easy for us to have a sort of Norway-style deal. And they've completely gone against that.
Well, there was the maximum of sort of hostile rhetoric with incredibly optimistic evaluations of how things were actually going to go.
I mean, we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but we were talking about the fact that Boris Johnson's requested to bypass the European Commission to speak to Macron and Merkel directly, and has been rebuked. To what extent do you think that move is just posturing for our press? Because it seems very much like the government is trying to line up its excuses in early and to say they were stonewalled and they were denied any discussion in good faith. So they can say that all of this is the EU's fault, which I personally would dispute. I think the EU is doing what you would expect a rational actor to do when acting in its own interests when faced with a threat. Aside from anything, if the UK ends up with a particularly good deal, then that would act as an incentive for other nations to leave the European Union, which is not in its best interests. So what extent do you think it's posturing?
The European Union's position's been fairly consistent throughout, and it was predictable before the referendum. It's only Britain that's gone from, as I say, these absurd slanders. I mean, you remember Michael Gove compared the European Union to the Soviet Union. Boris Johnson said it was like previous attempts to unify Europe by Napoleon and Hitler. And then later, when he was foreign secretary, he talked about it being a liberation. I think he was on some kind of panel with European diplomats. It's not a brilliant way of trying to get people to come over to your side of an argument. That said, they have, I think, been incredibly patient and generous with us, while, as you say, sticking to what their actual position is.
Yeah.
So wonderful that we've recaptured our former glories and standing tall on the international scene and gaining greater respect as a country through this whole avenue. But what do people expect? What do they think was going to happen?
Mm. I find that there's this sort of strange contradiction in the Leave camp, in that they've spent, the good part of several years implying that the EU is this, gargantuan monstrosity that only ever acts in bad faith and is protectionist and a racket and is completely malevolent. And then when the EU doesn't do what the UK government wants, they act completely surprised. Bizarrely, they could act as though they're sort of strangely vindicated by saying, look, they're not doing what we want them to, but they don't. And I find that contradiction a bit sort of strange, really.
Yeah, they can say the refusal of results from Europe show why we have to leave the European Union in the first place. They can't really square that with having said it would be really easy to do so.
Yeah.
Nor can they continue to pretend that the central lie of Brexit, which is that you could leave the European Union and be as prosperous as you are inside of it. There was no evidence for that. All the evidence was against it. Whether the people who campaigned for it, including the Prime Minister, the now Prime Minister, believed it, we'll never know. But the proof will be in the cake, as no one says.
Yeah. I feel like the Labour Party in all of this is actually the one part of British politics that might come out on top, in the sense that they are no longer likely going to have to make that very difficult decision on voting for, against, or abstaining on any potential Brexit deal. Because in that situation, they seem damned if they do and damned if they don't. If they vote for it, they're voting for a deal that likely isn't going to be very good and isn't necessarily going to make the UK highly prosperous. But if they vote against, they'll be viewed as the architects of no deal, even though I would really lay that responsibility at the Conservatives' feet. So I can't help but think that they're the ones who are not necessarily benefiting, but they've dodged a bullet to some extent in all of this.
For the Labour Party to benefit from the government taking ownership of a Brexit that no one's happy with, I think there'd have to be a widespread disenchantment in the public at large with the idea of Brexit in the first place. They'd have to start to accept that this was probably a mistake all along, and that Labour, when it remembered to say something negative about Brexit, was right. Because I think Keir Starmer is still associated with the Remain cause, even though I don't think he's nothing to point, he can point to as an achievement. There have been no real concessions the whole time he was Brexit Secretary, or since he's become Labour leader. So I'm sceptical about whether it would shake out that way.
So on that fairly jovial note, shall we move on to the second, also fairly morbid item for today, which is COVID. How do you think the government's getting on tackling the COVID crisis at the moment?
Well, obviously the fact that the vaccinations have started. I'm not going to say roll out because, again, I don't like that being used as a verb for things that aren't spherical and therefore don't roll. Vaccine rollout, it's vaccinations. That's obviously very good news. I don't know that it's to the credit of the government especially, but to the extent that they've made spaces available and told the army, when they're not getting ready for conflict with our European neighbours, to help administer the vaccine, that's obviously what you would expect from the government. But again, there's the bare minimum, and I'm hesitant to give them points for the absolute least they could be doing. Again, it comes in the context of National Audit Office report or series of revelations about just how much money's been squandered on contracts with private companies that either don't know what they're doing, or they get the contract without any proper tender and after the work's already started. Outsourcing has been a major problem in this country for years and years. And actually, Private Eye magazine's been excellent at cataloguing that, and the way that whenever you think,
particularly,
we'll give this to a company and they can do it cheaper and quicker and more efficiently, it always costs more and is done terribly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about the pandemic is yes, it's an extraordinary event that no one could really have predicted, but it seems to be a sort of great exposer of what is or isn't functioning in individual governments. And what has been exposed by the pandemic is this element of cronyism within the Conservative Party, whereby it seems like friends of those in number 10 are more likely to get contracts for deployment of things like PPE, even if they're not the best qualified to do so. And I hope that it changes. But I dare say I'm skeptical it'll change whether or not, that happens before the next general election. I just hope that they manage to curb the fatality rate in the meantime, because these things have real life consequences.
Yes, they do, and we still don't really have a test, trace, and isolate system worth the name.
Yeah, completely. I noticed that the government's also reduced the isolation time if you have COVID symptoms from 14 to 10 days. I'm not sure what the basis of that is. I'm hoping that it's evidence-based, but it seems somewhat surprising.
Speaking of terms that have gone out of fashion, it was only a few months ago that the government was saying they were being led by the science. And people would argue about what exactly that means, because science isn't one monolithic thing, it's a process and so on and so on. But they've dropped that one now. I mean, what's the science behind letting multiple households mix over Christmas?
Yeah. I worry that this is going to be a sort of perfect storm where a lot of households are going to be mixing and traveling across the country for Christmas at the same time that we suddenly have news that there is a vaccine. Fantastic. But not that many people in the country have actually received the vaccine, and whether this might give people a sort of false sense of security, going, there's a cure that's coming and it's fantastic. And we're suddenly going to see a massive spike in infections in January, because the reality is not that many people have been vaccinated in any case, and because people have been mixing because of Christmas. And I really worry that that's going to be the real consequence of what the government's decided to do with regards to household mixing at Christmas.
Yes, I mean, one of Johnson's press conferences, in a moment of lucidity, he did try and downplay people's enthusiasm. He does seem to have at least learnt that if you signal to people that they should, that things are going to be all right quite soon, that they will sort of relax on following the rules.
Yeah.
Gosh, it's been hard work getting him to remember that. But then again, he completely drops it when it comes to Christmas. So
I think it's going to be interesting to see sort of what's happened with regards to the vaccines, in the sense that the government's effectively had to bet on which vaccines are going to come out most rapidly and which are going to have the best safety profiles. And they bet primarily on the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. I can understand why, given the fact that that was developed in conjunction with Oxford University. But it hasn't been the fastest to come out. It doesn't seem to have the highest efficacy rate. It's fairly good, it seems, if it's given one low dose and then a much higher dose, particularly in young people, from what I've read. But it doesn't seem to have quite as high an efficacy rate as, say, the Pfizer vaccine. And I've read that they're now doing clinical trials combining the AstraZeneca vaccine with the Sputnik, the Russian vaccine, to see if that improves the efficacy of it. So I don't know what's going to happen next, and I'm kind of curious as to whether or not those bets will pay off. And obviously it looks like there's going to be at least some restrictions at the moment on disseminating the Pfizer vaccine, because 2 healthcare workers with a history of anaphylaxis went into anaphylactic shock after receiving their vaccine on just day 1 of deployment. So I think we're going to see a lot of possibly unexpected news stories in the coming weeks. Of course, that breeds into the sort of the more broad question of trying to encourage compliance and people receiving the vaccine when there's a lot of anti-vaccination fake news on the internet. And I don't know how the government's best going to do it. I think the fact that the Queen has said that she's going to let people know when she's received the vaccine is actually quite a good thing.
Yeah, the trouble there is the sort of people who will be skeptical about taking the vaccine might also be of the opinion that the Queen is a shape-shifting lizard. So
yes, some of them.
She might not be the best poster person for a vaccination campaign.
I think anyone they pick might be subject to that. kind of question. You know, if you really believe that the world is run by lizards, then anyone they'd pick is probably implicated in the conspiracy.
What they really need to do is get a lizard to take the vaccine publicly.
Yeah, that would definitely work.
And show this, if even I, shape-shifting lizard, are taking the vaccine, then sure you serfs have nothing to fear.
There's also questions about which GP practices are going to be disseminating the vaccine, because if you're going to be part of the vaccine rollout, and I'm sorry because I know you hate that phrase so much, if you're part of that scheme, then you have to basically sign a waiver saying that you're going to be providing a service every day. I think it's from like 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or something. And some surgeries just can't cope with that, given the level of demand they already have with people coming into the practice for other health reasons. So I hope that doesn't disproportionately, say, impact people in lower income groups. That would be my worry, that what we'll see is some GP practices in disadvantaged areas who are understandably struggling with the strain of the pandemic and their other requirements, that they end up not deploying the vaccine.
Wouldn't it be nice if some fraction of the amount of money squandered on contracts to private companies that don't do what they're charged with doing went to supporting GPs and local services, since that's the most effective way of getting the vaccine to the people who need it?
So that takes us to our third item. It's exactly a year since the general election. And this is going to sound like a totally insane question to ask, but if we exclude the pandemic from the equation, what has changed?
I think if you were to cryogenically freeze someone in the days following the 2019 general election and then revive them now, the things they'd find least surprising would be that Boris Johnson's prime minister turns out to be an incompetent liar who doesn't understand the national interest, or answering a question with an answer that's relevant to the question and honest, or administering anything more complicated than, say, a haircut.
I kind of wonder whether...
That's my Christmas message.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether the anger and frustration at the government would be greater or less had the pandemic not happened. Because it seems a bit like that COVID creates this environment whereby there's almost a distraction from what is probably about to happen with regards to Brexit, which is complete chaos. Whereas that tension might be reaching a peak right now if the pandemic hadn't happened. That said, the pandemic has exposed a lot of the cronyism and the waffle of the government, and therefore there is this separate anger at the government for its COVID response. So I think that a lot of what's happened in the last year, obviously aside from the pandemic, it's quite predictable. But I wonder where the sort of national sentiment and level of support for the government would be now if the pandemic hadn't happened.
I think without the pandemic, we probably would have been speaking about Brexit a lot more than we have been this year. But it's quite likely that the government would have revealed its incompetence on some other issues. As far as Labour's fortunes go, I think they were sort of written in to the election of Starmer as leader, because he sort of became leader on a promise that couldn't really be delivered, or a series of promises that pulled against each other, which was to sort of make the party electable and stand up to stamp out anti-Semitism in particular.
Yes.
But also to honour the Corbyn years and pursue a socialist agenda. So he by doing this, he was able to get a majority of the Labour Party to choose him as leader, but it didn't help him reconcile the strain between those things.
It seems that there's a level of indecisiveness there that I think would have been far more exposed to the press had the pandemic not happened. Because while the Equality and Human Rights Commission was reporting on Labour's institutional anti-Semitism, obviously there are hundreds of COVID deaths every day. So of course, you know, that takes far greater importance and receives more press coverage than the civil war that seems to be happening right now in the Labour Party.
I think Starmer's being dragged to a harder line just by circumstances, and realizing that he can't fudge some of these differences. Some of them are principle, and I also think it's a shame that he's been so timid about policy proposals, especially in a year when there was an opportunity to be quite radical about the role of the state and public services and everything else.
And I think regardless of Brexit and the pandemic, this problem was always going to come to a head at some point. I think that he's been forced into taking more bold action than we might have possibly expected a year ago, based on events such as Corbyn's statement following the Equality and Human Rights Commission report. But it was always going to be a problem, and a problem that I dare say certain elements of the right-wing press would be very pleased to exploit.
Yeah, because he could be charged with being a hypocrite. Oh, now you say you're against these things, but you went along with it before.
Exactly.
He probably can weather that. It's just the truth of it will tell, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
It may be the case that you needed someone shiny and new to take over and steady the ship.
So I think that's about all we have time for. Thank you for joining us again, Adam, and we'll be back in a fortnight.